Okay, so today I'm going to look at a concept of like how much people have to censor and inhibit their thoughts in society. In fact, you could argue that's the whole purpose of society and social interaction, for example, right? Like, pretend people didn't have a language, they would still survive, they would still live like throughout history. So they might communicate on a more basic level, but language isn't really necessary or inherent or objective or not tied to the natural state of people. So when you try to come up with these psychological conditions that attribute to speech, like, oh, this person's nonverbal, well, all people are nonverbal because language is not innate to human existence, right? It's made up. Doesn't mean it's bad, doesn't mean you can't do it, but you can't use that as an empirical basis to judge their behavior and act like there's some specific state that you have to be in. Like, people inherently are atheists, people inherently are nonverbal. Like, there's no such thing as a language, right? You could say they'd be making sounds and stuff, but that's different. Like, so you can't attribute any meaning to that. It's a contrived state that is sort of trained and so forth. But what I would say is the fact that something that you do will be seen as, oh, like that's a form of rebellion or a form of something, you know, you're doing anti-contrivance or anti-social or something. But it's really just your inherent state despite the contrivance. It's like you're not doing it to spite contrivance or against contrivance. You're just simply doing it, and contrivance is butting its head to say, oh, you can't do that. Right, so it's a false inherent. Like, you're just doing one of the many things that human beings are capable of doing. But then, oh, it'll act like, oh, that's somehow against contrivance or against society or against... You're doing it to be sort of... anti-contrivance, and so right, it'll frame everything in false duality, like that kind of like Bolshevik rhetoric, kind of like a lot of other things. But it's a situation where, you know, like anything that you can't think in society, or anything that you're not allowed to think, you can only think in functional kind of reactive terms. And so it makes you realize that basically society is designed to counter thought, right? That's a lot of what people do, because like, what is it that people do? Okay, they're indoctrinated when they're young before they can think for themselves. Then as they grow up, they're constantly bombarded with stuff, like whether through their parents, whether through media, whether through, entertainment, even escapism, whether through, distractions, whether through, just like everything we do, like social interaction, is meant to counter thought. It's anti-thought. Again, what is it if nothing more than, oh, it's just a means to an end. You're only doing it because you want something, even if in an overextended way, like the stimuli acme through social contrivance, overextension, or whether it's zero-sum means through some artificial appeal to ego, right? It's like you can overextend it, and that's almost what we reward, is the degree of overextension, but that's not how we perceive it. It's kind of like anti-thought. If what you're doing is truly a sound process measure, it's consistent, it's logical, it's efficient, why would you need that, right? You don't need it to do something efficiently or effectively. You need it only to overextend self-interest to a collective, or vice versa. And so it's an incentive, it's just a way to control people. So it wouldn't be necessary if something was just zero-sum efficiency, right? If it was just, you're out in the jungle, you're just living, like, why do you need that, right? So it's only a way to control people and to counter thought, right? So everything you do socially is to counter the cognitive dissonance you have with the overextended state that you're in, some sort of imbalance, some sort of overextension for a mass collective of people, self-created conflict of contrivance. So the other aspect of that is the fact that one of these times I got to try to turn this like in a horizontal angle, which might actually be better. In fact, I know it's better for no, but I sort of like the vertical shit too, because then would that change the orientation of the stream? Because I kind of like these being in the mobile kind of whatever, where you scroll through in that sort of format. That's not something I normally do, so it's kind of a nice change. But when you go to upload it as a proper YouTube video, it's in like the weird with the black bars are bigger than the black bar on either side is bigger than the entire screen, and it doesn't matter, the visuals, but definitely getting good use out of the iPhone camera though, which is pretty good quality. And again, even the mic isn't bad, but the distance and everything is kind of fucked up. This is a good example of like, you just do something as a routine and that's it. Like, regardless of the scuffed nature, regardless of the lack of quality, right? You just somehow, some way do it. And then who knows? But I think, unfortunately, the algorithm has abandoned me. But no, what I was saying is the fact that look at the ways in which society counters thought, right? Whether through social interaction, which is trying to counter that and reduce it to a lowest common denominator, right? Reduce everything to the initial physical state, right? Which is not free. So you might think it's innocent, or you might even think that you desire it, or you kind of are associating your own identity with it, like, oh, that's something you really think or want or desire or whatever. It's a reflection of you, but it's carefully curated through society in such a way that you're not really thinking, right? It's no coincidence everything is the lowest common denominator, and we kind of act like that's a good thing, or we take pride in it, like, oh, that's normal, or that's something, intrinsic. But what you're missing in doing all that is the simple fact that what you're missing is, again, anything long form, the same exact measure or process. It's always subversive. It's always, we're going to reduce something from its inherent objective true state to something myopic and selective and limited, sometimes seemingly to our benefit, right? We're sort of twisting it to our benefit, but it's not real. It's not true. So you're always going to struggle against that. It doesn't mean you can't struggle against it. You might say, oh, it's worth it to do that or whatever, but it's always going to be that cognitive dissonance that you have. So it is sort of like the Jungian, I don't even know how you say it anymore, but Carl Jung, that people would always try to say to sound smart, Jungian, archetypes, whatever. Like I was familiar with them when I'm younger, but it's like either Freudian or Jungian archetypes to show you that everything is either the inherent or the contrivance response, which of course those are my terms, but whatever. I'll give them some credit in similar ideas. Like, either you have your inherent nature, which is to, your instinctual basis, which might be like, okay, you're not what people would normally do if they weren't inhibited by society, right? That nature is still there. So the fact that, oh, you have to socially interact and contrive and be restricted and have laws and have stigmas and have, social engineering and conditioning and have all these ritualistic things. We got to go to a party first and have drinks first and dumb ourselves down first, and then we can engage in this inherent hedonistic act that would be our inherent nature. It's the same tendency that you're reacting to. So that's the one analogy I always like to make. Like, who is really free and who is really the slave here? Who is really, primitive or sophisticated? Like, these cavemen type, nudist colony, right, more naturalistic existence, right, where they're having an orgy and they don't place any special emphasis on sex and stuff. They just do it freely, openly, as much as they want or not at all, right? Or the people who have to go to a ball and have a big party and work their whole lives and slave away and, lie and cheat and all this effort you go through and all this money and time and life you spend just to achieve the same end in a half-mass state, right? To a half-mass hedonistic way to be controlled and specify it, right? Which one is really primitive, right? Oh, they're just engaging in this carnal act like animals, but then they do an animal act like animals and then be done with it. Whereas you acting all posh and sophisticated, you obsess over it, you're a slave to it, you go jump through hoops for it, you base your whole life around it, right? Who is really the slave here? Who is really the primitive animal here? Where one of them is treating it for what it is, and then they can be free the rest of their life. They're not, they're not enslaved by it. They're not, repression leads to obsession, like I say. One of them is, again, basing their whole life around it. The other one is basing their whole life around it and jumping through hoops and going through extravagant things just to achieve a fraction of it, just to achieve a partial amount of what the inherent state and tendency and instinct and desire and suggested behavior would be. Whereas the other one is just doing it freely, right? So think about it that way. And I like the sort of incel talk that would be sort of contrarian, like, oh, you know, people would attack someone for being either asexual or, I guess you could say, hypersexual, but freely, kind of open relationship and stuff. They would condemn that and act like, oh, you're just doing that because you can't find the right one, or, you know, oh, you somehow lack the ability to do this, right? Stimuli acme basis. But it couldn't be that you're just mindless sheep who are controlled by this in a half-assed state, right? Either you do it fully and freely and openly, or you don't do it at all, instead of, oh, this half-assed state where you do it partially and you're controlled by it, and you use gratification, the social contrivance, and overcompensation as a placeholder in such a way that, you know, you are doing the same thing, but to make up for the lack of freedom or true value or inherent truth in what you're doing, you have to pose a false absolute, which is, again, a way to gratify the ego so that you can be controlled, such that you have, you know, you gratify the ego, and you do it in such a way that, oh, it's love, it's meant to be, it's absolute, it's not just a construct to control people in a half-mass state in an overextended collective mass society. The easiest way to explain that is the simple fact that you have, like, it's an absolute, but everybody has their own absolute. Like, it's a fairy tale, it's a Santa Claus, it's a, you know, Tooth Fairy, it's fairy tales for adults. Oh, it's an absolute, but it's one that everybody can have their own little absolute with this one other person, and, like, that's not how an absolute works, right? It's, and if it, you know, relationships don't work out, then, oh, that just doesn't count. It's a non-accountable false absolute. So it's something you can say, well, it's good to struggle to try to maintain that illusion, but it's really, you're kidding yourself, you're fooling yourself to try to be restrained in a way that it goes against your nature. And the absolutist would identify here the minimalist option too. You can say, oh, open relationships, or, and again, that could still be done with consent. That's not even the question. It's a question of limiting it. Like, okay, you can have an open relationship with consent as opposed to a monogamous relationship. I hate the word monogamous, actually, but whatever. A single partner relationship with consent. Right, like, it's not the same thing. You're being controlled, but the way to control people is to make them think they want it and have them struggle against it. So just remember, be aware of the nature of the larger process that I'm telling you here at all times, so then you know everything you experience is a self-created conflict of contrivance. And so, right, like, it's not the same thing. You're being controlled, but the way to control people is to make them think they want it. Let me listen back, because it's kind of... Remember, be aware of the nature of the larger process that I'm telling you here at all times, so then you know everything you experience is a self-created conflict of contrivance. And so, just, that's such a mouthful. I want to see how clear it sounds. It doesn't sound too bad, actually. So that's me listening back on my phone as I'm watching. But I don't know. It's a hard concept to understand, but getting back to the main point is that society exists to counter thought. What do people do? And it's ultimately your fault. Blame the audience, blame the society itself for playing into these things, for being controlled by them, for desiring them to distract you from the cognitive dissonance of an unqualified empirical state, right? Different than the inherent conflict of nature, right? That you would have the inherent nature, the inherent conflict, but what it means is the fact that thought has a lot of propaganda against it. It's a bad thing to think, even though that's what defines humanity, separates them from animals. That's the one statement that really would break through to a lot of people. But thought is bad. You can't think freely, only think in functional terms, reduce everything to the lowest common denominator, social contrivance, physical state, lesser form of the same thing. Everything is thought, everything is a reaction to thought, everything you do or don't do is, you know, even social contrivance. It's the same process, you just don't realize it. It's a form of thinking. You're just kind of trying to quiet down the mind, or shut the mind, or counter the thoughts, and reduce them to some egotistical, you know, gratifying social thing. So you're countering thought instead of embracing thought, and so everything is a reaction to it anyway. whether you see a picture or whether you go to that place yourself, whether you consume a $100 thing or a $1 thing, whether you do some hobby or another, whether you are in some posh, lavish place or sleeping out in the woods, right? Everything is perception, everything is thought anyway, right? It doesn't really matter. The physical impact that some of those things have can be different, but if you perceive it, oftentimes that's what you get fooled by, right? The difference between a $100 bottle of wine or a $10 bottle, if you enjoy it, it tastes just as good. If, it doesn't, a lot of the time the intrinsic value is not that different. But the point is, again, what do people do with what little freedom they have in society, or what do people seek out? They distract themselves with escapism and entertainment. They dumb themselves down, so with alcohol and stuff like that. So why is that desired or necessary, and how are you credible if you do that? It shows you the problem right there. It's like, oh, everything is absolute and perfect, but we have to dumb ourselves down in order to accept it. Right, so the very possibility of objective thought and freedom and self-awareness is a bad thing. We condemn it. We're taught to hate thought and condemn it. The appearance of thought, for example, oh, it seems like somebody's crazy, right? Like they're staring out in the distance or something like that. Or, oh, look, I'm even like what I'm doing now. I'm talking to myself. So even though it's the same thing, anything anybody else could say to you, you could say to yourself. You could observe, you could think, you could, so it's a lesser form of the same thing. It's not about whether something is good or not. It's about control, right? You can't control somebody's thought. They can think anything and therefore do anything at any time, and that freedom is bad, and it's associated with only the negative things that people would do, but it could be any of the positive things people could do too, and any of the free and variable and inherent things that people could do in a self-actualized, inherent, natural state. And so what it means is that you're basically looking at it from a perspective that right, it's the same thing like a collective mass of people being controlled by the worst and the lowest common denominator of. There's always going to be one bad person in a group of 100 million people, and because of that person who does something bad, oh, now you're all restrained, you're all restricted. So the same thing, oh, thought is restricted and condemned because, oh no, you could think like I'm doing now, or anybody, and then, oh, that might lead you to do something that isn't in line with what society wants, or something harmful, but it could also lead to everything else. So you're right to fear it because, oh, it could lead to a person doing something bad, but it could also lead to them not doing something bad and doing something free. And wouldn't you rather make that decision for yourself instead of saying, oh no, the mind is too dangerous, so you got to dumb it down because you can't handle and control it, which is the whole basis and premise of society anyway, that people can't control themselves, that they have to be forced to, which isn't even necessarily true. And it ends up relying on a certain goodness and discipline of people anyway, but it's kind of a farce, right? Oh, look how disciplined and good we are, but after we've been through indoctrination, after we're subject to constant contrivance, social contrivance, enforcement. So the other point is the simple fact that you're able to consider that, dismissals of thought don't work with the long-form postulate, which is my primary prognostication, because look at like what I'm doing now and how many of these sessions I've done and how much over the years I've done. It's not about me at a certain point. You can say, oh, you're only doing this because of blank, right? People try to attribute, like, oh, it's, childhood or some. It doesn't matter at a certain point. You're looking at objective ideas, objective concepts, either logical razors. Either they make sense or they don't. Either they're true or they're not. Either there's value or there isn't. It doesn't matter who's saying it, right? That only works on a myopic, superficial level, right? But when you're thinking about things on a surface level, but look at how much thought you can think all day, every day, all the time. Oh, you're only doing that because of blank, because of some experience you had, or because of some nature of yourself. But that doesn't make sense because, well, you're only behaving the way you do instead, however you behave. But, the mass collective of people only behave the way they do because they're exposed to indoctrination and constant contrivance through media, social interaction, through parents, through government, through society, right? So, oh, they're only reacting to that. So how, the mass people are mindless and just reactionary, whereas, oh, you could say like with somebody who isn't, if I'm being objective, then I'm thinking about things that don't directly relate to the state that I'm in versus people who just reinforce the state that they're in. So one of them is at least being able to be objective despite their state, whereas otherwise just reinforcing and letting their state define and dictate everything that they think and do, and associating their identity with non-choice reaction, indignant insistence, And so those cracks and holes in contrivance show, like, oh, it's absolute, but then it's absolute, but then then it requires you to not think and condemn thought. So the appearance of thought is bad, something's staring out in the distance because you can't predict what they're thinking or what they're going to do, so it could be anything, it could be free. So freedom is bad because people can't control it, and we're taught to project the worst things to it, when it could be anything else. It could be positive, could be neutral, could be the same thing that you'd be doing effectively, just at a higher level, like, oh, you were socially interacting about some inane thing you did today. Meanwhile, somebody could be thinking about the larger process of the same thing, like, oh, the only reason why you value that thing is because it's a counter to thought, or because it's a counter to this inherent tendency that you have, that you pretend you don't have, but then you are actually defined by it because you have to socially counteract it, basically. So, but yeah, look at the long-form posture that way. At a certain point, it's not about you. It's not about your specific state. It's not about your specific experiences. You can look past that and be objective. So it doesn't matter, right? But that's how people try to be defined, and they try to do it in a reactionary way, but it doesn't actually work because, right, you could do that with contrivance too. Share in and relate to the same contrivance that you didn't choose to be subjected to, and then you take a certain amount of pride in it. Non-choice reaction defines you, instead of self-actualizing from an inherent base state, which is hard to do, but at least mentally you could try to do it. And then, despite the influences that you have. So trying to discredit people doesn't make sense, because everybody is discredited then, because they're all subjective, imperfect, flawed. They all have an impure, biased kind of perspective to try to reinforce their own state. So is your perspective just a product of that to try to reinforce it, which isn't credible at all then. All these labels which imply a false absolute. Oh, you label somebody as if to imply that then you or the society or the kind of norm that you're trying to reinforce is absolute and perfect and unquestionable, even though it suffers from the constant conflict of contrivance, and even by the same measure and pretense and standard, you're not holding it fully accountable. And so you get caught in this half-assed state of some supposed standard, but you don't actually follow it directly or fully. And then, what was the other way that I explained this? Basically, at a certain point, anybody can be objective, anybody can think anything at any time and infinitely and indefinitely. So don't fear thought. The fact that you have to condemn thought and prevent thought means that what's forcing you to do that is flawed. It's contrived in society, etc. The fact you have to not think. It's the same thing as saying, oh, everything is fine, just close your eyes and then it's okay. So it's the same thing, just don't think and then it's all good. But the fact that you have to do that shows you it's not. But then again, if you thought objectively it wouldn't lead to some subversive, overextended collective state, it'd be variable, right? It'd be a variable which can't be controlled. So you have to be an unthinking, mindless sheep, and then you can be more easily controlled. So that's the real reason. That's what normalcy is, non-accountable false absolute. It should be some utopian state where everything's perfect, but it's not. You're constantly struggling to maintain the illusion of that instead of sacrificing appearances for the reality. But again, it wouldn't lead to this mass collective state. So it's kind of ex post facto justification. Like, whatever state you're already in, you're just going to mindlessly reinforce it. Like, if you were living in World War II Germany, it would be normal to go along with that. If you're living in China right now, it would be normal to go along with that. So even though you would condemn those things, you would still go along with them if you were in that time, just like you're doing right now in your own society. So you're a mindless sheep. That's kind of the base mass prognostication. And so at least you can be aware of it. At least you can be objective. At least you can do what I'm doing now, right? Even though it doesn't evidently change anything. But that's the difference. Are you going to be aware of it, or are you going to reinforce and insist upon, desire it, falsely desire it? So the other thing is the fact that basically what you're doing is, anybody can be objective and think. So like, at some point you realize, oh, if you think enough, now you stop personalizing thought, because it's trivial. It's like, oh, you're defined by this one thing you said or thought at this one time. What about everything else? You never had a camera in my head, says Truman in the greatest movie ever made, The Truman Show. Like, how many ways do you have to have this explained to you for you to understand it. And it's like, thought is infinite, it's objective, it's free, it's not limited, it doesn't have to reinforce, or, so you can define somebody, okay, label me one thing, this is like a test. I talk about this one subject, I observe this one thing, so you label me based on that. Then the next day I talk about something different, I observe something different, oh, then you label me based on that. Then, so you can try to limit people to their physical state, but that's kind of controlled by the environment around them, the society contrives around them. So that can easily be manipulated, but that doesn't have to define you. What about your infinite objective mind that every day you can be labeled something different than? So every minute you can think something different than what you did the last second. Like, even contradictory things. So one day you'll be labeled this extreme thing, then the next day you'll be labeled the opposite extreme. So which is it, right? There's no way to, like, an easy example is politics. Like, oh, today I could be talking about Democrats and criticizing them. Oh, so you must be a MAGA. And then tomorrow I could say, okay, now today I'm discussing Republicans and their flaws. Oh, so I'm a libtard, I'm a, mindless Democrat sheep. So, in other words, being objective is like that, where anybody can do it. And, so society might try to do that. It tries to label people and reduce them to something that can be controlled. But, right, that's not how the mind has to work. So you can be objective and think about and talk about a million different things, contradictory things, seemingly, variable things. So at some point it's not you. It's not about you. The mind has its own capability and infinite nature, which people fear and condemn and try to ostracize the act of thinking. But that's just freedom. That's just, at least you can be free in your mind despite the contrived state, but then it's harder to control you. It's harder for you to go along with it. There's a cognitive dissonance, right, between the controlled physical state that you're in. So the physical state is used to control the mind and define the mind. But it's hard to imagine a uniform state existing otherwise. So what do? We condemn thought, and we have to control and counter it all the time and act like, well, we have to constantly, we gotta use entertainment, escapism, polyfavoritism, distraction, right? And it's kind of like, why should you have to do that if if what you're doing is actually a sound process, right? If it's logical. So it's sound, it's absolute, but it requires you not to think about it. It's very similar to religion in the sense that, oh, it's absolute, but you just can't question it. You just can't think about it. Or, oh, you got to use escapism, entertainment, etc. So you kind of associate it with their identity, but what people get trapped in the modern era that doesn't even work, or doesn't make sense, is a lot of things that you don't need, right? You only, and it's a trap, right? Oh, electricity and modern conveniences and technology and entertainment, escapism. The only reason why you desire those things or think that you need them is to overcompensate for how inhibited your life is in the first place. So, like, again, if you were out in the wild in nature, you could fend for yourself. You could, live off the land, pick berries, hunt animals, whatever. You might think, oh, you need all these conveniences, but not only do you not need them, but the only reason why they're kind of perceived to be necessary is because of the mass number of people and how inhibited you are. You're not allowed to go out in nature because, oh, some corporation or government or person is stamping their ownership on it, like, oh, you're trespassing on my land. So because of that subversive state where you're not allowed to do basically anything freely, oh, now you rely on electricity and running water. You really don't, but because you allow yourself to be deferred to this collective mass of people, you allow yourself to be in the subversive state, and then it's used against you. See how you need this, see how you tolerate this, see how you are controlled by this. Right, you would say, like, see how you're controlled by this in such a way that controlled on behalf of things that you don't need. Right, a lot of society, people need very little. You can eat meager meals, you can be out in the woods, you can be, you can feign the longevity process, but you're called out on your bullshit when you realize people drink and smoke and they do things unhealthy that don't lead to the longest lifespan. So that's not your basis anyway, so you can't be controlled on behalf of it. But what it really means is that you're controlled on behalf of things that you don't even need and you don't necessarily even want, but you treat them as default and take them for granted. So it's always about the next overcompensation. It's always about the next way to bypass and subvert. It's never about the inherent conflict that exposes. Like, for example, right, it's like, oh, how can we get this next overcompensation for this flawed, imperfect, cognitive dissonance-inducing contrivance state? How can we distract or overcompensate from it next and overextend more instead of, oh, it's unqualified in the first place, so maybe we don't require or desire it, and so we go to a minimalist state and we say we don't need all these things, we don't need anything. The biggest thing you have to resist then is the stimuli acme and preserving the stimuli acme. So you don't need all these things, so how can you be controlled on behalf of them? You're asexual, so how can your life be based around, oh, get a white picket fence and have kids, and base your whole life around being a slave to the half-mass hedonistic stimuli acme? How can you be controlled on behalf of something that you don't even require or desire in the first place, right? How can that be? And so now you understand that it's very questionable.